Welcome back, everybody. Today we are on tutorial 8 of our Learning to Use GeoGebra series, and today we're going to be exploring the properties of a quadratic polynomial. So for this tutorial, we want to be in the perspective algebra, and that'll give us our graphical screen and the algebra window as well. And so to start off, what we want to do is we want to type a equation for a quadratic polynomial f of x equals x squared in the input bar and hit enter. And so that will plot a quadratic polynomial in the graphics view, and it will also put it the equation that we typed in over in the algebra view as well. So let's move this graphic to have its center in the window. And so now let's look at a couple of things that we can do. So if we actually click on our equation in the algebra view and we hit the left arrow key, we can see that that will shift our quadratic polynomial to the left, and it'll also update the corresponding equation in algebra view. If we hit the right arrow key, that will shift it to the right, while dynamically updating its equation in the algebra view. We can also press the up and down arrow keys to shift the quadratic polynomial up and down. And in that way we can kind of explore the relationship between the equation that we have in the algebra view and the graph that we have in the graphics window. We can also double click on that equation and you can update the equation manually. For example, we can multiply x squared by a constant term in the front, and when we're doing multiplication we either put a space, in this case between the 3 of the x squared, or you can put an asterisk, and we can say how that changes our equation. We can put in a couple of different values and change the equation, see how that changes the graph itself. We can put in a negative value. So one thing about the properties of the quadratic polynomial is, of course, it grows very rapidly in the y direction with values of x. So we see by the time that we get out to x equals 3 or x equals 4, we've already used up all of the y-axis that we have. So one thing that we can do to see more of this graph for more of our range of x values that we have plotted is you can right-click in the graphics view or the graphics window, and then you go to this x-axis, y-axis, and you can change the ratio of x to y-axis. So for this case, we can try something like 1 to 20, and we see now we can see the properties of our quadratic polynomial through all of the values of x that we have. And then we can also zoom in or zoom out in order to see more of the graph, so we can show some more of our x values by zooming out, and then we can move the graph around as well. And then of course we can just spice up the appearance of our graph by going to Object Properties. We can change the color. For example, we can change it to blue. We can go to Style, and we can increase the line thickness as well. Just kind of play around there to make the graph of the quadratic look a little bit nicer. So now what we're going to do is, it's okay to kind of try to shift things around a little bit, but we want to start to introduce the ability to give the users some interaction with the plot. So what we'll do is we'll learn how to create sliders where we can manipulate the parameters of the quadratic polynomial. So one way to create a slider is we can just create a new variable. In this case, we'll call it a. Say a equals 1 in the input bar. Hit enter, and then if we want to show a slider where we can manipulate the values of a, is we will you just click on the circle next to the variable, and that will make it visible, that variable visible as a slider, and then you can move that around and change its value. So right now, the value of that slider is not tied to anything in our graphics or our polynomial, but that shows you how we can move it around. A second way to create a slider is we can use the toolbar menu here, and we can go and select slider, and then you can just click on the location. So let's make another one. We'll call it B. And we can move it around like we can move around any other object. And then let's create one more, and let's call it S. So now what we'll do in the input bar is we'll redefine our function f as f of x equals a times x minus s squared plus b. And what that will do is that will tie our quadratic function to the values of the slider. So now we see the minus 0.2 that we have in A is out in front here. We have our B equal to minus 1. And then if we scooch this over a little bit, we can see our value, or sorry, this is the value for S. And then we can see our value for B in the equation. So now what we can do is we can move these sliders around, and now we can see how the properties of a quadratic polynomial changes as we manipulate the value. So we can see it automatically being updated here in the algebra view as we change the slider around, and you can also see the graph of the quadratic update dynamically in the graphics view. So we can see what the impact of A does. We can see what the impact of B does. And so we notice when we're doing B, we can see it's sort of shifting up and down, but 5 to minus 5 is very small compared to the range of y values that we've had displayed since we updated our axes. So let's just go ahead and double click on that slider, and we want to be able to shift it over a much wider range. So let's go from min of minus 300 to a max of 300 and change the increment values to be 10. Okay, and so now we'll close that out. So now when we shift, we can see that really see the impact of B, and so we can shift this quadratic up and down by changing the parameter B. We'll go back and see what our S slider does. So now we can see our S will shift the parabola to the left and to the right, but that is also shifting over a very small range. The default values are a small range compared to the range of values taken up by the x-axis. So let's double click on that as well, and let's change it to minus 30 out to positive 30, going by increments of 1. Now we'll be able to see much more detail what the impact of changing S has, so we can watch again. We can watch it change in the algebra view, we can watch it change in the graphics view, and then we can mix all three in and set a certain equation value if we want, and look at what that equation does. So one thing we notice, if the parameter A is positive, the parabola opens upward. If it goes negative, the parabola changes and now opens downward. And so those are just a few very interesting things that we can do to plot equations and kind of begin to interactively explore how changing certain parameters of the equations will change the graph, so we can start to get some dynamic interaction and a real feel for how these parameters change. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you again next time.